Here in our second lecture of Chapter 11, The Cotton Revolution, we're going to cover sections 3 and 4. And we'll start here with cotton and slavery. Now, the rise of cotton and the resulting upsurge in the United States' global position wed the South to slavery. Without slavery, there could be no cotton kingdom, no massive production of raw materials stretching across thousands of acres worth millions of dollars. Indeed, cotton grew alongside slavery. The two moved hand in hand. The existence of slavery and its importance to the Southern economy became the defining factor in what would be known as the Slave South. Although slavery arrived in the Americas long before cotton became a profitable commodity, the use and purchase of slaves, their moralistic and economic justifications for the continuation of slavery, and even the urgency to protect the practice from extinction long before the Civil War, all received new life from the rise of cotton and the economic, social, and cultural growth spurt that accompanied its success. Slavery had existed in the South since 1619, when a group of Dutch traders arrived at Jamestown with 20 Africans. Although these Africans remained under the ambiguous legal status of unfree rather than being actual slaves, their arrival set in motion a practice that would stretch across the entire continent over the next 2 centuries. Slavery was everywhere by the time the American Revolution created the United States, although northern states began a process of gradually abolishing the practice soon thereafter. In the more rural agrarian South, slavery became a way of life, especially as farmers expanded their lands, planted more crops, and entered the international trade market. By 1790, 2 years after the ratification of the Constitution, 654,121 slaves lived in the South. Then, just Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and the Southwest Territory, which is now Tennessee. Just 20 years later, in 1810, that number had increased to more than 1.1 million individuals in bondage. The massive change in the South's enslaved population between 1790 and 1810 makes historical sense. During that time, the South advanced from a region of 4 states and 1 rather small territory to a region of 6 states and 3 rather large territories. The free population of the South also nearly doubled over that period, from around 1.3 million in 1790 to more than 2.3 million in 1810. The enslaved population of the South did not increase at any rapid rate over the next 2 decades until the cotton boom took hold in the mid-1830s. Indeed, following the constitutional ban on the international slave trade in 1808, the number of slaves in the South increased by just 750,000 in 20 years. But then cotton comes and grows and changes everything. Over the course of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, slavery became so endemic to the Cotton Belt that travelers, writers, and statisticians began referring to the area as the Black Belt, not only to describe the color of the rich land, but also to describe the skin color of those forced to work in its fields, line its docks, and move its products. Perhaps the most important aspect of Southern slavery during the so-called Cotton Revolution was the value placed on both the work and the body of the slaves themselves. Once the fever of the initial land rush subsided, land values became more static and credit less free-flowing. For Mississippi land that in 1835 cost no more than $600, a farmer or investor would have to shell out more than $3,000 in 1850. By 1860, that same land, depending on its record of production and location, could cost as much as $100,000. In many cases, cotton growers, especially planters with large lots and enslaved workforces, put up slaves as collateral for funds dedicated to buying more land. If that land, for one reason or another, be it weevils, a late freeze, or a simple lack of nutrition, did not produce a viable crop within a year, the planter would lose not only the new land, but also the slaves he or she put up as a guarantee for payment. So much went into the production of cotton, the expansion of land, and the maintenance of enslaved workforces that by the 1850s, nearly every ounce of credit offered by Southern and even Northern banks dealt directly with some aspect of the cotton market. Millions of dollars changed hands. Slaves, the literal and figurative backbone of the Southern cotton economy, served as the highest and most important expense for any successful cotton grower. Prices for slaves varied drastically, depending on skin color, sex, age, and location, both of purchase and birth. In Virginia in 1820s, for example, a single female slave of childbearing age sold for an average of $300. An unskilled man above the age of 18 sold for around $450, and boys and girls below age 13 sold for between $100 and $150. By the 1840s and into the 50s, prices had nearly doubled, a result of both standard inflation and increasing importance of enslaved laborers in the cotton market. In 1845, plowboys under age 18 sold for more than $600 in some areas, measured at $5 or $6 per pound. Prime field hands, as they were called by merchants and traders, averaged $1,600 at market by 1850, a figure that fell in line with the rising price of cotton they picked. For example, when cotton sat at 7 cents per pound in 1838, the average field hand cost around $700. As the price of cotton increased to 9 cents, 10 cents, and then 11 cents per pound over the next 10 years, the average cost of an enslaved male laborer likewise rose to $775, $900, and then more than $1,600. The key is that cotton and slaves helped define each other, at least in the Cotton South. By 1850, slavery and cotton had become so intertwined that the very idea of change, be it a crop diversity, anti-slavery ideology, economic diversification, or increasingly staggered cost of purchasing and maintaining slaves, became, disgusting and a problem for the Southern economic and cultural identity. For quiz purposes, you need to know that cotton had become the foundation of the Southern economy. Indeed, it was the only major product, besides perhaps sugarcane in Louisiana, that the South could actually effectively market internationally. As a result, Southern planters, politicians, merchants, and traders became more and more dedicated or obsessed to the means of its production, slaves and slavery. In 1834, Joseph Ingram wrote, "To sell cotton in order to buy Negroes, to make more cotton to buy more Negroes, is the aim and direct tendency of all operations of the cotton planters. His whole soul is wrapped up in that pursuit." 23 years later, such pursuit had taken seemingly religious character, as James Sterling, an Englishman traveling through the South, observed, "Slaves and cotton, cotton and slaves, these are the law and the prophets to the men of the South." The Cotton Revolution was a time of capitalism, panic, stress, and competition. Planters expanded their lands, purchased slaves, extended lines of credit, and went into massive amounts of debt because they were constantly working against the next guy, the newcomer, the social mover, the speculator, the trader. A single bad crop could cost the most wealthy planter his or her entire life, along with those of his or her slaves and their families. Although the cotton market was large and profitable, it was also fickle, risky, and cost-intensive. The more wealth one gained, the more land one needed to procure, which led to more slaves, more credit, and more mouths to feed. The decades before the Civil War in the South, then, were not times of slow, simple tradition. They were times of high competition, high risk, and high reward, no matter where one stood in the social hierarchy, but the risk was not always economic. The most tragic, indeed horrifying aspect of slavery was its inhumanity. All slaves had memories, emotions, experiences, and thoughts. They saw their experiences in full color, felt the pain of the lash, the heat of the sun, the heartbreak of loss, whether through death, betrayal, or sale. Communities developed on a shared sense of suffering, common work, or even family ties. Slave communication in the slave markets of the urban South they communicated and worked together to help their families ease their loads or simply frustrate their owners. Simple acts of resistance, such as breaking a hoe, running a wagon off the road, causing a delay in production due to injury, running away, or even pregnancy, provided a language shared by nearly all slaves in the agricultural workforce, a sense of unity that remained unsaid but was acted out daily. Beyond the basic and confounding horror of it all, the problem of slavery in the Cotton South was twofold. First, and most immediate, was the fear and risk of rebellion. For quiz purposes, you need to understand that there was nearly 4 million individuals that were living in slavery in the South in 1860, and nearly 2.5 of those were in the Cotton Belt alone. A system of communication, resistance, and potential violence among slaves did not escape the minds of slaveholders across the region and the nation as a whole. As early as 1785, Thomas Jefferson wrote in his Notes on the State of Virginia that slaves should be freed, but that they should be colonized to another country where they could become an independent people. White people's prejudices and black people's recollections of the injuries they have sustained under slavery would keep the two races from successfully living together in America. If freed slaves were not colonized, eventually there would be convulsions which would probably never end, but in the extermination of one or the other race. Southern writers, planters, farmers, merchants, and politicians expressed the same fear for more than a half century. "The South cannot recede," declared an anonymous writer in 1852 issue of New Orleans-based DuBose Review. "She must fight for her slaves or against them. Even cowardice would not save her." To many slaveholders in the South, slavery was the saving grace of not only their own economic stability, but also the maintenance of peace and security in everyday life. Much of the pro-slavery ideology rested on the notion that slavery provided a sense of order, duty, and legitimacy to the lives of individual slaves, feelings that Africans and African Americans could not otherwise experience. Without slavery, many thought blacks would become violent, aimless, and uncontrollable. Some commentators recognized the problem in the 1850s as the internal slave trade, the legal trade of slaves between states along rivers and along the Atlantic coastline. The internal trade picked up in the decade before the Civil War. The problem was rather simple. The more slaves one owned, the more money it would cost to maintain them and extract product from their work. As planters and cotton growers expanded their lands and purchased more slaves, their expectations increased. And productivity, in large part, did increase, but it came on the backs of slaves with heavier workloads, longer hours, and more intense punishments. The great limitation to production is labor, wrote one commentator in American Cotton Planter in 1853. Many planters recognized this limitation and worked night and day, sometimes literally, to find the furthest extent to that limit. According to some contemporary accounts, by the mid-1850s, the expected production of an individual slave in Mississippi's Cotton Belt had increased from between 4 and 5 bales, which was about 500 pounds each, per day, to between 8 and 10 bales per day on average. Other, perhaps more reliable sources, such as the account book of Buena Vista Plantation in Tensas Parish, Louisiana, list average daily production at between 300 and 500 pounds per hand, with weekly averages ranging from 1,700 to 2,100 pounds per hand. Cotton production per hand increased by 600% in Mississippi between 1820 and 1860. Each slave then was working longer, harder hours to keep up with his or her master's expected yield. Here was capitalism with its most colonial, violent, and exploitive face. Humanity became a commodity used in work to produce profit for select groups of investors, regardless of its shortfalls, dangers, and immoralities. But slavery, profit, and cotton did not exist only in rural South. The Cotton Revolution sparked the growth of an urban southern city culture that served as southern hubs of global market, conduits through which the work of slaves and the profits of planters met and funded a wider world. It is this urban culture that we're going to talk about here in Section 4. Much of the story of slavery and cotton lies in the rural areas where cotton actually grew. Slaves worked in the field, and planters and farmers held reign over their plantations and farms. But in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, there was an extraordinary spike in urban growth across the South. For nearly half a century after the Revolution, the South existed as a series of plantations, county seats, and small towns, some connected by roads, others connected only by rivers, streams, and lakes. Cities certainly existed, but they served more as local ports than as regional or national commercial hubs. For example, New Orleans, then the capital of Louisiana, which entered the Union in 1812, was home to just over 27,000 people in 1820. And even with such a seemingly small population, it was the second largest city in the South. Baltimore had more at 62,000 people in 1820. Given the standard 19th century measurement of urban space, or basically a town of 2,500 plus people, the South had just 10 in that year, one of which, Mobile, Alabama, contained only 2,672 individuals, nearly half of whom were enslaved. As late as 1820, Southern life was predicated on rural lifestyle, farming, laboring, acquiring land and slaves, and producing whatever that land and those slaves could produce. The market, often located in the nearest town or city, rarely stretched beyond the state line, even in places like New Orleans, Charleston, and Norfolk, Virginia, which had active ports as early as the 1790s. Shipments rarely, with some notable exceptions, left American waters or traveled further than the closest port down the coast. In the first decades of the 19th century, American involvement in international trade was largely confined to ports in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and sometimes Baltimore, which loosely falls under the demographic category of the South. Imports dwarfed exports. In 1807, U.S. imports outnumbered exports by nearly $100 million. And even as the Napoleonic Wars break out in Europe, causing a drastic decrease in European production and trade, the United States took in almost $50 million more than it sent out. Cotton changed much of this. at least with respect to the South. Before cotton, the South had few major ports, none of which actively maintained international trade routes or even domestic supply routes. Internal travel and supply was difficult, especially on the waters of the Mississippi River, the main artery of North American continent, and the eventual gold mine of the South. With the Mississippi's strong currents, deadly undertow, and constant sharp turns, sandbars, and subsystems, navigation was difficult and dangerous. The river promised a revolution in trade, transportation, and commerce only if the technology existed to handle its impossible bends and fight against its southbound current. By the 1820s and into the 30s, small ships could successfully navigate their way to New Orleans from as far north as Memphis and even St. Louis if they so dared. But the problem was getting back. Most often, traders and sailors scuttled their boats on landing in New Orleans, selling the wood for quick profit or a journey home on a wagon or caravan. The rise of cotton benefited from the change in transportation technology that aided and guided the growth of Southern cotton into one of the world's leading commodities. In January of 1812, a 371-ton ship called the New Orleans arrived at its namesake city from the distant internal port of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This was the first steamboat to navigate the internal waterways of North American continent from one end to the other and remain capable of returning home. The technology was far from perfect. In fact, the New Orleans sank 2 years later by hitting a submerged sandbar covered in driftwood. But its successful trial promised a bright, new future for river-based travel. And that future was indeed bright. Just 5 years after the New Orleans arrived in its city, 17 steamboats ran regular upriver lines. By the mid-1840s, more than 700 steamboats did the same, and by 1860, the Port of New Orleans received and unloaded 3,500 steamboats, all focused entirely on internal trade. These boats carried around 160,000 tons of raw product that merchants, traders, and agents converted into nearly $220 million in trade, all in a single year. More than 80% of the yield was from cotton alone, the product of the same fields tilled, expanded, and sold over the preceding 3 decades. Only now, in the 1840s and 50s, could those fields, plantations, and farms simply load their products onto a boat and wait for the profit, credit, or supplies to return from downriver. The explosion of steam power changed the face of the South, and indeed the nation as a whole. Everything that could be steam-powered was steam-powered, sometimes with mixed results. Cotton gins, wagons, grinders, looms, and baths, along with countless others, all fell under the net of this new technology. Most importantly, the South's rivers, lakes, and bays were no longer barriers and hindrances to commerce. Quite the opposite. They had become the means by which commerce flowed, the roads of modernizing society and region. And most importantly, the ability to use the internal waterways connected the rural interior to increasingly urban ports, the source of raw materials, cotton, tobacco, wheat, and so on, to an eager global market. Coastal ports like New Orleans, Charleston, Norfolk, and even Richmond became targets of steamboats and coastal carriers. Merchants, traders, skilled laborers, and foreign speculators and agents flooded these towns. In fact, the South experienced a greater rate of urbanization between 1820 and 1860 than the seemingly more industrial urban-based North. Urbanization of the South simply looked different from that seen in the North and in Europe, where most northern and some European cities developed along the lines of industry, creating public spaces to boost the morale of wage laborers in factories, on the docks, and in the storehouses. Southern cities developed within the cyclical logic of sustaining the trade in cotton that justified and paid for the maintenance of the enslaved labor force. The growth of Southern cities then allowed slavery to flourish and brought the South into a more modern world. Between 1820 and 1860, quite a few Southern towns experienced dramatic population growth, which paralleled the increase in cotton production and international trade to and from the South. The 27,176 people in New Orleans claimed in 1820 expanded to more than 168,000 by 1860. In fact, in New Orleans, the population nearly quadrupled from 1830 to 1840 as the Cotton Revolution hit full stride. At the same time, Charleston's population nearly doubled, Richmond expanded threefold, and St. Louis experienced the largest increase of any city in the nation, expanding from a frontier town of 10,049 to a booming Mississippi River metropolis of 160,773. The city and the field, the urban center and the rural space, were inextricably linked in the decades before the Civil War, and that relationship connected the region to a global market and community. The southern cities grew, they became more cosmopolitan, attracting types of people either unsuited or uninterested in rural life. These people brought rural goods to the market desperate for raw materials. Everyone, it seemed, had a place in the cotton trade. Agents, many of them transient from the north, and in some cases Europe, represented the interests of planters and cotton farmers in their cities, making connections with the traders who in turn made deals with manufacturers in the Northeast, Liverpool, and Paris. Now, for quiz purposes, you need to understand that among the more important aspects of Southern urbanization was the development of a middle class in these urban cities that had never fully developed in more rural areas. In a very general sense, the rural South fell under a two-class system in which landowning elite controlled the politics and most of the capital, and the working poor survived on subsistence farming or basic unskilled labor funded by the elite. The development of large urban centers founded on trade and flush with transient populations of sailors, merchants, and travelers gave rise to a large, highly developed middle class in the South. Predicated on the idea of separation from those above and below them, middle-class men and women in the South thrived in the active, feverish rush of port city life. Skilled craftsmen, merchants, traders, speculators, and store owners made up most of the Southern middle class. Fashion trends no longer required an honest function, such as a broad-brimmed hat to protect one from the sun, knee-high boots for horse riding, and linen shirts and trousers to fight the heat of the unrelenting sun. Silk, cotton, bright colors came into vogue, especially in the coastal cities like New Orleans and Charleston. Cravats, golden brooches, diamonds, and the best stylings of Europe became the standard of urban middle class in the South. Neighbors, friends, business partners formed and joined the same benevolent societies. These societies worked to aid the less fortunate in society, the orphans, the impoverished, the destitute. But in many cases, these benevolent societies simply served as a way to keep other people out of the middle-class circles, sustaining both wealth and social privilege within an insular, well-regulated community. Members and partners married each other's sisters, stood as godparents for each other's children, and served, when the time came, as executors of fellow members' wills. The city bred exclusivity, that was part of the rush, part of the fervor of the time. Built on the cotton trade, funded by European and Northeastern merchants, markets, and manufacturers, Southern cities became headquarters of the nation's largest and most profitable commodities, cotton and slaves. They welcomed the world with open checkbooks and open arms. That brings us to the end of this second lecture. In the third lecture, we will cover the last two sections.